During the 18th century, France's artillery was organized under the Valliere system. This meant having cannons really far away, used not against infantry but mainly in sieges. These cannons were largely immobile but pretty damn effective about doing what they were set to do, which was break down city walls. The first major change in how cannons were constructed was in 1749. The Dutch figured out that they could cast a cannon in one piece. Instead of having to cast it in multiple pieces, then fuse them together, which was not necessarily the most structurally sound, they could instead have one piece, then bore out whatever holes they had to make in the cannon. Because they did this, they could make cannon walls thinner, therefore having smaller cartridges, which made overall the cannon more lightweight. Also, this construction made cannons more accurate. Starting in 1764, Valliere family members were no longer the war ministers in France. This meant that new systems of artillery could be adopted. So, France decided that they would go for the more lightweight cannons. They changed their 4, 8, and 12-pound cannons, which were the main cannons of the time period, to be lighter, like a lot lighter, about half the weight. For example, I think the 8-pound cannon weighed about 1,300 pounds under the Valliere system, but the new lighter models weighed about 600 pounds. So, since they were lighter, they were more mobile, and they could be moved by fewer men and horses, so less men had to be set for each cannon. In addition to that, new technology was implemented into how the cannon was being used. So instead of, whereas before, wedges would be put under the tip of the cannon to aim it, but now they could use screws, which would angle the cannon far more accurately. Also, they kind of added sights to the cannon so the gunners could see, okay, I'll hit that point that far away. Because of that, the accuracy of the ordnance went up a lot. Starting in 1805, France implemented the Year 9 system. This was basically them consolidating their artillery construction. Instead of a 4, 8, and 12-pound cannon, they moved the 4-pounder up to a 6-pounder, though they still did make 4-pound cannons. They didn't melt away the ones they had. They just stopped making them as much. Instead, they made more 6-pound cannons. And then the 8-pound cannon was either brought into the 6-pounder or brought up to the 12-pounder. So they consolidated into just 2 primary sizes instead of 3. The 12-pound gun also gained significant power and range during this time, and just like before, their guns became more mobile. They made them lighter again. So in 1759, the Prussians experimented with having a mounted artillery unit. What this meant, it didn't mean that they shot the cannons well on horseback. It meant that all the gunners, along with the horses pulling the cannons, everybody was mounted so that they could move around faster. Sometimes if they get really desperate and they ran out of horses or something, the gunners would actually ride on the cannon pieces just to move a little bit faster. But so they would have these mounted units of cannon. What this allowed them to do was be more mobile on the battlefield. For example, they would be able to get to high ground really quickly and defend it with cannon, and typically that meant that infantry was there too. So when they first used this, they were able to trick enemy armies, thinking they had already had their infantry at the high ground, when actually it was just some preliminary cannons that were able to hold the ground for a while. To make the horse units even faster, they would actually hollow out their round shots so they were even lighter and could be moved around more. In 1792, the French also adopted the system of a mounted artillery. They thought it was a good idea. An advantage of this was that they were also able to use canister shot for the first time, which is devastatingly effective against infantry, especially due to the fact that a canister shot has a range of about 400 or 600 yards, whereas a musket at the time only had a range of about 200 yards, so they could outdistance themselves from the muskets and then just chop through the muskets like they were butter. The first time the French used the canister shot, actually the first time canister shot was used, they didn't entirely know how to use it, and they came up within 125 yards of Russian infantry, and even though the artillery unit got fired upon and had a few casualties, a fair amount of casualties, once they got set up, they fired the canister shot into the Russian lines and did devastating damage for something like 25 minutes. And the canister shot was particularly effective against square formations, which was the typical defense to cavalry. They could now just whip through a square formation using canister shot. At its peak, France had about 54 companies of these mounted artillery units. One company of this mounted artillery would typically include 2 6-inch howitzers, maybe some 4-pound guns, but I told you they still existed. Either an 8 or, way less commonly, 12-pound guns. They preferred the 8 because they were lighter and could move even faster, which was the whole point of the mounted artillery. And then the rest they would be using the 6-pound cannons, because they claimed that the 6-pound cannons were the ideal cannon to be used by this mounted artillery. In addition to that, they'd have to have horses carrying all the ammunition for the cannons. So after the turn of the 19th century, France had a very mobile way to use artillery that had pretty much never been done before, except for the Prussians who inspired it. There were pretty much 2 schools of thought as to how to use artillery at the time. One was opposing the enemy's battery. The goal of this would be to weaken their artillery so much that they couldn't hurt your troops. Another perk of opposing the battery is that artillery gunners were harder to train. It took more time. So if you killed more of their gunners, their artillery would be weaker in the future. Fair enough. Instead of opposing the enemy battery, the other option was to oppose the enemy's infantry and, to a much lesser degree, their cavalry. The goal of this was to weaken the enemy field force, so much so to the point that their artillery would be unsupported, and then your cavalry could go through, sweep up their field forces, then sweep up their cavalry. This was actually supported by the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, and a fair amount of French military strategists during the 1740s. However, to make this work, you would need a big mass of cannon fire, and that wouldn't be seen until about the time of Napoleon, when he started really emphasizing on artillery. Traditionally, how cannons were laid out before Napoleon changed everything was that your really big cannons would be way up in the back, and they'd be supporting the entire battlefield. They'd be shooting everywhere and seeing what they could. Your smaller cannons would be interspersed along your entire front line, damaging all the units on the enemy's line throughout the battle. Napoleon changed this. Instead of spreading out all the smaller cannons in the front, what he would do is focus his fire on one central point. He would focus on either where he was getting beaten, or, more often the case, the point that he wanted to take. He would focus all of his fire there. Then when the firing stopped and the enemy line at that point was so broken or routed that it was weak, his infantry would then be able to go in, sweep up no problem, and then win the battle. How cannons were typically used was from a range of about 500 to 1,000 yards, depending on the size of the cannon. As we discussed, canister shot had a far shorter range, but was also used for specifically infantry. The idea was that the smaller guns would be able to make up in rate of fire what they lost in firepower. There were 2 strategies on how to use cannons, both used differently when they needed to be. When the enemy was moving in column formation, you would fire perpendicularly to it, or as close as you could get, so that you could sweep through, but also your accuracy didn't matter so much. You wouldn't want to do that. You wouldn't want to fire at them like that, because, pretty easy to miss. But if you fired perpendicularly or as close as you could get, you'd be able to sweep through a fair amount of the troops. More like that, you'd be able to sweep through a fair amount of the troops while you're doing it, but also still with pretty high likelihood to hit. When the enemy was formed in a line, what you would do is fire, again, obliquely, and you would try and sweep through at least a few units, depending on how thick it was. But also, you're probably going to hit, if you hit the high-low right, you would hit them. So if this is the line, you'd fire at them like this, try and sweep through a few units deep, and do some damage. In case my hands weren't clear enough, this is a slightly better portrayal of how it would have looked. At this time, there was also a trend, before Napoleon changed everything, where battalions of infantry would have their own artillery following them around, typically pretty small guns, that would be able to support them in combat. And this sort of faded out of fashion. It wasn't particularly effective. So instead, the infantry units would be almost just all infantry, they'd have grenadiers and line infantry. But this helped Napoleon's strategy be even more effective, because no enemy artillery would be countering his infantry, while his artillery could fire heavily on one point, wait for it to break, infantry come in and save the day. It wasn't until the late 1700s that artillery was considered its own branch of the military, Until that point, it was actually still considered just part of the infantry division of the military. Artillery was given independence on how it would organize itself for mobilization on the battlefield, and this slight freedom allowed them to mobilize faster than they may have if they were under a strict bureaucratic control. Also, Napoleon extremely valued his artillery. He had some artillery in his military education, and he made a point of having a lot of staff directly under him whose jobs was specifically artillery related. They would be responsible for maintaining the artillery schools, training the gunners. They would be making sure that the munitions and supplies for the artillery was properly sorted out. They would be in charge of the artillery defense of the forts, and additionally they would serve in the field in an officer position with the artillery in conjunction with the infantry. Ideally, for every division of infantry, about 4,000 men at the time ideally, there would be one cavalry artillery company, and there would also be one infantry artillery company to accompany that. That would be roughly 12 guns per 4,000 men, which comes out to about 3 guns per 1,000 men, which is what he was striving for. The more guns per men you have, in Napoleon's eyes, that would mean the more effective your infantry could be. At the larger corps levels, additional artillery would be given to bigger armies. In addition to that, the general, or typically Napoleon himself, would have reserve artillery with him who he could control directly, which he greatly enjoyed, but also thought had great effect in battle. Napoleon really liked massing up his cannons. Sometimes these mass cannon groups would have 18 guns in them, sometimes well over 100 guns in them in one concentrated place. This would be used to hold back enemy charges, really, really thin enemy lines, provide general defense, or weaken an enemy line right before an infantry charge to cement their chances of victory. Some of Napoleon's council advised him that his artillery should practice conservative firing so that they wouldn't run out of ammo during the battle. Instead, Napoleon said that they would employ continuous firing, and to avoid running out of ammo, he made sure that his cannons had plenty of ammo continuously, roughly about 300 shots per gun. In the process of Napoleon updating his artillery and making it a much stronger part of his military, there was a learning curve. In 1809 at the Battle of Wagram, the artillery was sort of brand new in its new deployment, and a big mass of artillery went forward, too far actually, so it couldn't be supported by the army, and got massacred by the enemy army, to the point where infantry, once they recaptured the guns, had to man the guns for the remainder of the battle. At this point, they pretty much figured out how to use artillery, and from that point on, France was able to use artillery with devastating effect. Before the campaign of 1812, Napoleon eventually brought back the battalion-level small gun artillery. This is because he really believed in artillery's effectiveness and wanted as much of it as he could. Why Napoleon was so concerned with artillery? There were probably 2 reasons. One, it was very effective at winning battles. But secondly, Napoleon did care about loss of life, not only on the French side, but to a lesser extent, but still an extent. He cared about the loss of life on the enemy side. And using artillery was a good way to rout enemy soldiers instead of having to kill them so slowly in battle. But also, and much more so, using artillery against the enemy would prevent his men from having to die as much. And the effectiveness of Napoleon's artillery change is apparent throughout history. It lasted until and through World War I. Shell shock is called shell shock for a reason, because artillery was so damaging to the soldiers in the trenches.